Imagine an entity that cannot be killed. The most powerful empires humanity has ever produced have all made the same fatal mistake. They marched into the Iranian plateau with swords unsheathed, completely confident that they could wipe this civilization off the face of the earth forever. The Macedonian phalanxes of Alexander the Great invaded this place. The brutal Roman legions marched through here. The Arab armies swept across under the banner of a new religion. And the aggressive Mongol cavalry of Genghis Khan tore through this land, leaving behind nothing but horrifying towers of skulls. Any other nation would surely have disappeared forever after enduring such a catastrophic number of blows. They would have dissolved into the genetic and cultural melting pot of history, just as happened to the Babylonians, the Hittites, or the Assyrians. Yet with Iran, something completely inexplicable took place. Time and again, despite losing battles on the field, losing their capital, and suffering under occupation, the Iranians achieved something no one else in the world could do. They absorbed their own conquerors. Only a few decades would pass, and the violent invaders would begin to speak Persian, build Persian architecture, adopt the Persian state bureaucracy, and even wear the clothes of the local people. Once again, the East essentially digested the West and the nomadic tribes. How has Iran managed, from ancient times until today, to force every major power in the world to be wary of it? How have they preserved their identity? And how did Greater Persia, a country with 5,000 years of history, voluntarily give up its legendary name, forcing the whole world to call it Iran? This is the story of how a single nation invented the concept of time we live in today, turned geopolitics into a holy war between light and darkness, and learned how to lose battles to ultimately gain eternal victory. To understand the depth of this civilization, we need to go very far back in time. Traditionally, the Western world considers Mesopotamia, meaning Sumer, and Babylon, or ancient Egypt, as the cradle of civilization. In this worldview, Iran is often sidelined, and that is a great historical injustice. Evolution followed its natural course here. 50,000 years ago, Neanderthals dominated these lands, only to be replaced by Cro-Magnons 36,000 years ago. But the real revolution began later. Archaeologists have discovered urban-style settlements on Iranian territory, such as the Giroft culture and the Sialk ziggurats, dating back 6,000 to 7,000 years. Pottery jars from the 4th millennium BC prove undeniably that one of the oldest civilizations on the planet evolved right here, standing as an equal to Mesopotamia and China. The first major geopolitical player in this land was Elam, a state in southwestern modern-day Iran with its capital at the city of Susa. The Elamites were so powerful that in the 26th century BC, they practically imposed their will upon the Sumerians. But the most astonishing event occurred in the 23rd century BC, when the king of Akkad, Naram-Sin, went on a war campaign against Elam. The conflict did not end with a simple truce. A written treaty was signed. It guaranteed Elam's independence on the condition that they align their foreign policy with Akkad. Think about that. This is the first international treaty recorded in human history. The Iranian space stood at the very origin of global diplomacy. However, genetically, the Elamites were closer to the people of Mesopotamia. The people we call Iranians today arrived here later, between the 20th and 15th centuries BC. Nomadic tribes began to pour down into this mountainous plateau from the north, from the steppes of Central Asia and the Caucasus region. They belonged to the massive family of Indo-European nations, representing its distinct Indo-Iranian branch. Surprisingly, their ancient language is a direct relative of Latin, Greek, and the languages spoken across Europe today, including English and Spanish. Settling on these lands, they began to call themselves Aryans, meaning noble, and named their new homeland Arianum Veja, the land of the Aryans. Over time, this word transformed into the familiar name we know as Iran. They blended with the ancient culture of Elam and divided into powerful alliances, the most famous of which were the Medes and the Persians. It was here, in these harsh mountains and deserts, that Iran's primary weapon was born. It was not the chariot, nor was it special bows. It was ideology. Long before Christianity and Islam appeared, a religion was born on the Iranian plateau that overturned human consciousness: Zoroastrianism. For the ancient Iranians, life was not simply a series of meaningless accidents or the cyclical change of seasons. The universe was perceived as a battlefield of an uncompromising total war between Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of light, truth, and order, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of absolute evil, lies, and darkness. The first great empire of the Aryans was not Persia, but Media, founded in 670 BC. The Medes did not last long, but they managed to destroy the fearsome Assyrian Empire before being overthrown by their own kinsmen, the Persians. In 550 BC, a man named Cyrus the Great, carrying the bloodlines of both Persia and Media, united these two peoples to build the Achaemenid Empire, the first true superpower in human history. Cyrus was unlike the tyrants of the past. When conquering Lydia, the Greek city-states, or Babylon, he did not destroy temples, nor did he enslave the people. He built an empire based on respect. His successor, Darius I, expanded the borders from Egypt to the Indus Valley. Nearly 50 million people, accounting for half of the Earth's population at that time, lived under Persian rule. Darius divided the country into 20 administrative regions called satrapies, introduced a unified tax system, minted gold coins called darics, and laid down a road network along which the world's fastest state postal service raced. But history does not forgive weakness. In an effort to protect the empire from nomadic darkness, Cyrus the Great ventured into Central Asia to wage war against the Massagetae tribe. And there, the greatest emperor met his end. The battle was so brutal that the Persian army was completely annihilated. According to Herodotus, the leader of the Massagetae was Queen Tomiris, who, seeking revenge for her son's death, ordered her soldiers to find Cyrus's body. She beheaded him and cast his head into a leather bag filled with human blood, declaring that since he craved blood, he should now drink his fill. Despite this tragedy, the empire continued to survive. We are often accustomed to the idea that the famous Greco-Persian wars, those fought by the 300 Spartans, crushed the Persians. That is a Western myth. True, the Greeks defended their independence. But for the massive Achaemenid Empire, the loss of a few border cities was merely a mosquito bite. The Persians simply changed their tactics. They began funding Athens, and then Sparta, pitting the Greeks against one another. Finally, in 387 BC, the exhausted Greeks were forced to sign a humiliating treaty under the terms of the Persian king Artaxerxes. What the Persians could not take with a massive army, they purchased. Persia became the undisputed master of Greece without firing a single shot. However, The greatness of the Achaemenid dynasty lay not only in swords and spears, nor in gold and silver, but in an unprecedented spiritual architecture, religious tolerance, and the management of cultural diversity. At Persepolis, the magnificent capital commissioned by Darius, the reliefs on the walls do not depict executions or scenes of slaves in chains as seen in previous empires. Instead, they portray delegations from across the empire carrying distinct offerings, walking with dignity and pride. This was the symbol of a Pax Persica, the Persian peace, where the rights of the conquered were guaranteed as long as they paid taxes and remained loyal. This tolerance reached its peak when Cyrus liberated the Jews from captivity in Babylon, allowing them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. This act etched his name into history not just as a warrior, but as a savior in Judeo-Christian culture. However, darkness always lurks where the light is brightest. As the empire expanded to an unimaginable size, luxury and palace intrigues began to erode its core. Later kings no longer possessed the iron will of Cyrus or the administrative wisdom of Darius. They immersed themselves in splendid palaces distant from the army and the people. It was this internal fracture that set the stage for a terrifying storm from the west, a storm named Alexander. The collapse of the Achaemenids was not due to a lack of power, but because they became too vast to be controlled by a weak central government. A brilliant chapter of history was about to close, but the legacy of a multicultural world, of the connection from east to west, and of the aspiration to turn geopolitics into a war between light and darkness would live on forever in the blood and bone of this land. In 330 BC, the final true disaster struck the Achaemenid dynasty in the form of a young and ambitious king from Macedonia. Alexander, known to history as the Great, led the elite Macedonian phalanxes to ruthlessly crush the Persian army. The pinnacle of destruction occurred when Alexander ordered the burning of the magnificent capital Persepolis, turning 500-year-old architectural masterpieces into piles of ash. At that moment, it seemed the millennial history of Iran had reached its permanent end. From the ruins of the Achaemenids, a Hellenistic Seleucid state emerged, ruled by Alexander's generals. Yet, this was exactly when Iran's unique survival mechanism was activated. Eastern culture began to systematically swallow its Western conquerors. Even Alexander himself began to wear Persian attire and adopt the court rituals of this nation. The policy of Hellenization was stifled by the powerful and profound ancient Iranian worldview. By the 3rd century BC, the Parthians, another Indo-Iranian tribe, rose up to expel the Greeks from the sacred land and establish the Parthian Empire. The Parthian king, Mithridates I, proclaimed himself king of kings and the legitimate successor to the Achaemenid dynasty. For the next 5 centuries, the Parthians relied on highly mobile cavalry and the legendary Parthian shot to stand firm against the expansion of the mighty Roman Empire. They sowed terror among the Roman legions in the Middle East, proving that Iranian identity, far from disappearing, became sharper after every invasion. Imagine the scene of Parthian horsemen retreating on horseback while turning back to unleash fatal arrows into the chests of bewildered Roman soldiers. That was not just a military technique. It was a symbol of how Iran confronts the world, yielding, retreating, but always delivering the killing blow when the enemy least expects it. This resilience was rooted in deep Zoroastrian thought, where every citizen was considered a warrior of light in the eternal struggle against nomadic darkness and chaos. Under Parthian rule, Iran rebuilt vital trade networks, becoming an irreplaceable bridge on the Silk Road connecting China and the Mediterranean. They were not just warriors. They were skilled administrators who expertly combined old Persian administrative traditions with the flexibility of steppe tribes. However, excessive decentralization within the Parthian feudal system gradually created internal cracks. Noble families began to vie for power, weakening central control over distant borderland. Meanwhile, in the West, Rome never abandoned its ambition to control the lucrative trade routes of Mesopotamia. Decades of exhausting wars began to drain the resources of the Parthian Empire. But Iranian history always operates in surprising cycles. When one empire weakens, a new flame ignites from the very ancestral lands of the Persians. This time, it did not come from the northern steppes, but from the region of Pars, the birthplace of Cyrus the Great. A new dynasty, more devout, more centralized, and more proud, was preparing to step onto the stage of history to reclaim glory for the Aryans. This was the beginning of the Sassanid dynasty, the final golden age of Iran before the storm from the Arabian desert arrived. The battle for the soul of Iran continued, and the next conqueror would soon realize that invading this land is one thing, but ruling it without being transformed by it is something else entirely. In the year 224, a new golden era arrived on the Iranian plateau as the Sassanid dynasty took power. Hailing from the Pars region, the homeland of the first Persians, they created a powerful, centralized state where Zoroastrianism became the official state religion. Society was strictly divided into classes including priests, warriors, bureaucrats, and commoners, establishing an ideal system of meritocracy. Sassanid Iran was a superpower that waged wars of attrition lasting nearly 400 years, first with Rome and later with Byzantium for control over Mesopotamia and the Caucasus. Imagine the heavy armored cavalry known as the Savaran, the invincible knights of the East, confronting the most disciplined Roman legions head-on. This was not just a war for territory, but a clash between two ideologies, the two greatest civilizations of the world at that time. Sassanid emperors like Shapur I achieved the unthinkable by capturing the Roman Emperor Valerian alive at the Battle of Edessa, an unprecedented humiliation for Rome. The image of the great Western emperor kneeling before the horse of the Persian Shah was permanently carved into the cliffs at Nakshi-Rostam as a testament to the absolute power of the Aryans. Under kings like Khosrow I, Iran was not only militarily strong, but also became a center of global intellect. When philosophical schools in Greece were closed, scholars fled to Persia, bringing the refined knowledge of the West to blend with Eastern wisdom at the Academy of Gondishapur. This was where medicine, astronomy, and philosophy were preserved and developed, setting the stage for human progress centuries later. However, the price of greatness was exhaustion. Centuries of relentless warfare drained the blood of the Iranian giant. By the mid-7th century, the Sassanid Empire resembled a magnificent castle, but one fracturing from within due to internal power struggles and economic exhaustion after prolonged expeditions. At that very moment, an unprecedented new force emerged from the scorching sands of the Arabian Peninsula, taking advantage of this weakness to deliver the final blow. In 651, the capital of Persia fell, and the last king of the Sassanid dynasty was cowardly murdered. The entirety of Iran fell under Arab rule, marking the end of an era and the beginning of the Umayyad Caliphate. The Arabs brought a new religion, Islam, and a new language, Zoroastrianism, the fuel that had ignited the Iranian spirit for millennia, began to fade. For any other culture, this would have meant the total erasure of identity, as happened to Egypt or Syria, places that became permanently Arabized. But the Persians once again performed their miracle. Instead of dissolving, they began a reverse cultural invasion into the very administrative system of their conquerors. The most brilliant minds of Iran began to hold key positions in the caliphate's bureaucracy, transforming Persian into the language of science, poetry, and philosophy. Even within the heart of the Islamic world, the war to preserve the national soul entered a new phase, where the sword was replaced by the pen and fire temples were replaced by immortal verses. Iran had lost a military battle, but they were beginning a long-term plan to win the war for the eternal existence of Aryan culture. After the Sassanid Empire collapsed in 651, Iran did not vanish into thin air like other ancient civilizations. Various Arab dynasties made relentless efforts to force the people here to completely abandon their roots, but they failed before an invisible power, Persian intellect. Despite military defeat, the Iranians fought back spectacularly on the cultural front. As the Islamic Caliphate grew, particularly under the Abbasids, they began to rely heavily on Persian bureaucrats, scholars, and poets to operate the massive state apparatus. The Arab caliphs adopted the sophisticated administrative methods of the old Persians almost intact. The Farsi language, far from being destroyed, became the language of science and poetry, far exceeding the stature of a mere communication tool. The greatest knowledge in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine continued to be written in Persian, making Iran the intellectual heart of the Islamic world. Yet, after the Arab period, an apocalyptic disaster truly struck this land. In 1220, Genghis Khan and the aggressive Mongol hordes surged from the Central Asian steppes. The Mongols were not merely conquering territory, they were storms of destruction. They massacred the entire population of major cities and obliterated the 1,000-year-old irrigation systems, which were the lifeblood of the harsh Iranian plateau. It seemed Iran would permanently turn into a grazing land for nomads, but here the unthinkable happened once again. When Genghis Khan's grandson, Hulagu, established the Ilkhanate state on this land, the violent conquerors, accustomed to living in tents, were suddenly subdued by the refinement of the local culture. They embraced Islam, made Persian the official language of the state, and began building magnificent mosques with characteristic blue domes. Those who once destroyed libraries now became patrons of scholars and poets. By the end of the 14th century, history cruelly repeated itself as the storms of Tamerlane swept through, erecting towers of human skulls. However, even Tamerlane had to bow before the splendor of Persian art. He captured the finest artisans and took them to his capital, only for his descendants to create a brilliant Persian Renaissance, turning palaces into centers of exquisite poetry and painting. For nearly 300 years, Iran was a boiling cauldron where political power belonged to fearsome Mongol and Turkic tribes, but its soul remained quintessentially Persian. In just a few generations, the invaders were completely reprogrammed by the Iranian cultural code. They were no longer alien steppe warriors. They had become the preservers and developers of the Aryan identity in a new form. This is the most powerful testament to the strength of a civilization based not on the power of the sword, but on the depth of thought and the beauty of the soul. This ability to digest the enemy helped Iran overcome humanity's darkest moments to prepare for the rise of a dynasty that would unite faith and territory once more. After nearly 300 years in the boiling cauldron of tribes and foreign dynasties, a thunderous turning point occurred in 1501. A young man, only 14 years old, named Ismail, led an army of Qizilbash warriors who wore red hats symbolizing absolute loyalty, to capture Tabriz and proclaim himself the Shah of Iran. Ismail not only established the Safavid dynasty, but also carried out a revolution that permanently altered the nation's DNA. He declared Shia Islam as the state religion of Iran. This was a bold and genius geopolitical move, aimed at culturally and politically separating Iran from the rest of the Islamic world, which was largely Sunni, especially the arch-rival to the west, the Ottoman Empire. This conversion was not smooth. It was a violent process of compulsion, but created a unified, resilient, and distinct Iranian identity. Imagine the extreme tension on the border between two giants. On one side, the Ottoman army with cannons and elite janissaries, and on the other, the Safavid cavalry burning with religious faith. The Battle of Chaldiran in 1514 was a bloody testament to this conflict. Though the Persians lost the battle to superior Ottoman firepower, pride and sheer faith became a spiritual bulwark that could not be breached. By the era of Shah Abbas the Great, the Safavid dynasty reached the pinnacle of its splendor. He moved the capital to Isfahan and turned this city into a jewel of the world, to the point that it was called Isfahan is half the world. The vast squares, masterpiece bridges, and magnificent mosques with blue-tiled domes became symbols of the Renaissance of Persian art and architecture. Under Abbas, Iran was not only militarily strong, but also became a global trade hub, where merchants from Europe to China had to stop. However, religious isolation also brought heavy consequences. Iran was forced to fight alone on multiple fronts, from Uzbek invasions in the east to the expansion of the Russians and the British in the following centuries. By the 19th century, under the Qajar dynasty, Iran entered a period of severe crisis. The country began to lose vital territories in the Caucasus to the Russian Empire after devastating wars. Iran became a chessboard for the Great Game, the geopolitical confrontation between Britain and Russia. The British pumped oil, while Russian troops were stationed in the north, leaving the country suffocating under the weight of colonial powers. But the Aryan instinct for survival once again rose from the ashes of humiliation. As the world prepared for the First World War, Iran was no longer a fairy tale land of carpets and 1001 Nights stories, but was preparing for a painful transformation to enter the modern world. The power of faith and national identity, forged over centuries, would be the final weapon for them to reclaim their position on the international stage. Entering the 20th century, Iran stood at a life-or-death crossroads of history. In 1925, a man of iron will named Reza Shah Pahlavi took power after a military coup, beginning an extraordinary effort to modernize and industrialize the country. And in 1935, he made a move that sent shockwaves through global diplomacy. For centuries, the entire Western world had called this nation Persia, a name derived from Greek that evoked fairy tales, luxurious carpets, and an exotic, backward appearance. Reza Shah declared an end to that. He sent an official directive to all embassies that henceforth the country must be called by its true ancient name, the name its people had called themselves for millennia: Iran, the land of the Aryans. This was not merely a linguistic whim, but a steely political declaration that we are not an exotic colony, we are a modern nation with ancient roots, and you will have to reckon with us. However, Iran has always been a land of extreme turning points. Decades of political turmoil and the intervention of foreign powers eventually led to the explosion of the Islamic Revolution in 1979. The monarchy collapsed. Iran became a theocratic republic, and relations with the West were completely severed. And today, we are witnessing a startling historical paradox. In the modern mind, two completely different states exist in parallel. The word Iran triggers images of geopolitical tension, harsh sanctions, and grey news reports of conflict. Meanwhile, the word Persia, ironically, has not disappeared, but has donned a mythical aura of lost splendor, of exquisite poetry and fairy tale empires. Two names, one land, and an unceasing struggle over how it will be remembered. Throughout 5,000 years of history, this culture has developed an ultimate mechanism for survival. When colliding with the Macedonians, the Arabs, or the Mongols, they did not disappear, but absorbed their conquerors, remolding them to fit their own template. They stood at the source of civilization and invented the concept of linear time in which we live today. But perhaps their greatest battle is taking place right now, because sometimes, hidden behind the simple name of a country is a silent, invisible war between who we were in the past, who we are today, and how the world wants to perceive us. The Iranians have learned how to lose small battles to ultimately win against the eternity of time. The Aryan legacy does not lie in fallen stone walls, but in the ability to reprogram any force that attempts to impose itself upon them. From the warriors of light in Zoroastrianism to the scholars within the heart of the Caliphate, the soul of Persia has always been a powerful undercurrent, ready to submerge any invader in its own refinement. The story of Iran never ends. It is simply waiting for the next chapter to once again astonish the world with the power of endurance.